repeated consistently over time. The quiet rituals of barracks life helped soldiers endure separation, boredom, uncertainty, and loneliness. They transformed crowded military housing into communities and strangers into companions. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded people of who they were beyond the uniform. Yet, while routines provided stability, another force proved equally powerful during the war: friendship. In places far from home, among people who had never previously met, lifelong bonds were formed under extraordinary circumstances. How did complete strangers become some of the most important people in one another's lives? Story 4, Section 1, Friendship Under Fire, the deep bonds formed between strangers. Imagine arriving at a military training camp for the first time. You step off a train carrying a small bag and a great deal of uncertainty. Around you are hundreds of other recruits. Some are young, some are older. They come from different towns, cities, professions, and backgrounds. Most have never met before. At first, they are simply strangers. A few months later, many of them will know one another better than some lifelong friends. World War II brought together millions of people who otherwise might never have crossed paths. Farmers from remote villages trained beside factory workers from industrial cities. Teachers, mechanics, clerks, students, fishermen, and laborers suddenly found themselves sharing the same barracks, eating at the same tables, and following the same orders. The process was not always easy. Differences in age, education, culture, and personality sometimes created tension, yet military life placed people in circumstances that encouraged cooperation. Success often depended on teamwork, and daily routines created countless opportunities for relationships to develop. Friendship rarely appeared overnight. It emerged gradually through shared experiences. A conversation during breakfast, a card game after dinner, a long train journey, a difficult training exercise. These ordinary moments formed the foundation of trust. Many soldiers later struggled to explain exactly how certain friendships developed. There was no single event that transformed strangers into companions. Instead, familiarity grew through repeated interaction. People learned one another's habits. They discovered favorite stories, hometown memories, and personal ambitions. They learned who enjoyed joking, who preferred quiet conversation, and who could always be counted on during difficult situations. Over time, individual identities became woven into the life of the group. One soldier might become known for fixing broken equipment. Another might have a talent for storytelling. Someone else could be relied upon to keep spirits high during long periods of boredom. Every group developed its own personalities. These social bonds served an important psychological purpose. Military service often involved separation from family and friends. New relationships helped fill part of that emotional gap. No friendship could completely replace home. Yet companionship reduced feelings of isolation. The importance of these relationships became especially clear during periods of hardship. Training could be exhausting. Living conditions were sometimes uncomfortable. Long stretches of waiting created frustration and boredom. Facing such challenges alone would have been difficult. Facing them together made them more manageable. Shared meals played a surprisingly important role in strengthening friendships. Gathering around tables several times each day created opportunities for conversation and connection. Stories were exchanged, news was discussed, jokes circulated. Story 1, Section 2, Waiting for a Letter, the lifeline of mail across oceans. For some soldiers, the most difficult sound in camp was not artillery in the distance or the rumble of military vehicles. It was the sound of mail being distributed while their own name was never called. Mail call followed a familiar pattern. Soldiers gathered casually, pretending not to care too much. Some smoked cigarettes, others joked with friends. Yet beneath the surface, many were deeply invested in the outcome. The clerk would begin reading names. One by one, envelopes changed hands. Smiles appeared. Men immediately opened letters. Some quietly stepped away to read in private. Others shared news with friends. But a few soldiers remained empty-handed. At first, missing a single delivery did not seem unusual. Mail delays were common during wartime. Ships were diverted. Aircraft were reassigned. Entire supply routes could be interrupted by weather or enemy action. A week passed, then another. Soon, uncertainty began to grow. Many soldiers worried constantly about loved ones back home. News traveled slowly and rumors traveled quickly. A missing letter could lead to endless speculation. Had something happened to a wife, a parent, a child? Was a family simply too busy to write? Had the letter been lost somewhere along its long journey? No one could know for certain. This uncertainty often weighed heavily on morale. Military psychologists later observed that loneliness was not simply the absence of company. Soldiers lived surrounded by hundreds or even thousands of other men. The deeper problem was separation from familiar relationships and routines. You could sit in a crowded mess hall and still feel completely alone. To cope, many servicemen developed small rituals. Some carried photographs everywhere they went. Family portraits were tucked into wallets, helmets, or uniform pockets. These photographs gradually became worn from repeated handling. Corners bent, edges faded, yet they remained among a soldier's most valuable possessions. Others kept journals. The journals were not always dramatic records of battle. Often they contained surprisingly ordinary observations, a description of the weather, a complaint about food, a note about a card game played the previous evening. These entries created a sense of continuity. Writing helped soldiers preserve their identity beyond the military role they now occupied. A man could remind himself that he was still a father, husband, son, teacher, farmer, mechanic, or shopkeeper. The war had changed his surroundings, but it had not entirely changed who he was. Another important source of comfort came from friendships formed within military units. Shared hardship created unusually strong bonds. Men who had never met before the war suddenly found themselves living together for months or years. They ate together, trained together, traveled together, and often faced danger together. Conversations frequently returned to home. One soldier might describe a family farm in Iowa, another might talk about a fishing village in Scotland. Someone else might remember crowded city streets in London or New York. These stories served an important purpose. They allowed soldiers to revisit familiar places through memory. By sharing details of home, they temporarily escaped the uncertainty of military life. The military itself recognized the psychological value of maintaining connections. Special recreational programs were introduced in many locations. Reading rooms appeared in camps, libraries circulated books, chaplains organized social activities, military newspapers published stories from home. Even small comforts mattered. A newspaper containing hometown news could be passed from hand to hand until it became nearly unreadable. A package containing homemade cookies might be shared among an entire barracks. These objects carried emotional meaning far beyond their practical value. Yet despite every effort, loneliness remained a constant companion for many servicemen. It lingered during quiet evenings. It appeared during holidays. It surfaced unexpectedly when a familiar song played on a radio or when someone mentioned home. The war demanded physical endurance, but it also demanded emotional endurance. And as months turned into years, many soldiers discovered that surviving loneliness required something more than patience. They needed ways to create moments of normal life within an environment that was anything but normal. The solution often came through simple daily routines, small habits repeated day after day that helped transform military camps into something that felt almost like a temporary home. But what exactly were those routines? And how did they help thousands of soldiers preserve their sense of humanity during one of history's largest wars? Story 1, Section 3. Waiting for a letter, the lifeline of mail across oceans. As the war continued, many soldiers discovered that loneliness could not simply be endured. It had to be managed, much like hunger, exhaustion, or cold weather. The solution rarely came through grand gestures. Instead, it emerged through small routines that brought structure to uncertain days. Military life was built around schedules. A soldier might wake at the same hour each morning, eat meals at fixed times, perform assigned duties, and return to the same bunk every night. At first glance, these routines seemed dull, even repetitive. Yet for many men, they provided a sense of stability in a world that felt increasingly unpredictable. The familiar rhythm of daily life became comforting. Some soldiers developed personal rituals around letter writing. Every Sunday afternoon might be reserved for writing home. A soldier would gather paper, find a quiet corner if possible, and spend an hour describing recent events. Often he left out the worst parts. Military censorship limited what could be shared, but many soldiers also chose to protect their families from worry. They wrote about meals, weather, friendships, and harmless incidents. They rarely described fear in detail. As a result, letters often painted a calmer picture of wartime life than reality. Families did the same. Parents wrote reassuring messages. Wives emphasized ordinary household activities. Children described school, pets, or neighborhood events. Everyone participated in an unspoken agreement to preserve a sense of normality. This exchange of ordinary details became surprisingly powerful. A description of mowing a lawn or baking bread might seem insignificant, yet for a soldier stationed thousands of miles away, such details provided evidence that home still existed. The familiar world waiting beyond the war remained intact. Many veterans later recalled specific letters decades after the conflict ended. They remembered particular phrases, family updates, or jokes written in familiar handwriting. The physical letters often disappeared over time, but the emotional impact remained. In some cases, letters became treasured possessions passed down through generations. Today, archives and museums preserve thousands of these wartime correspondences. Historians study them not only to understand military operations, but also to understand the emotional lives of ordinary people. The letters reveal a side of war that official reports rarely capture. They show boredom, homesickness, hope, frustration, affection, and resilience. They reveal people trying to maintain human connections despite immense distances and uncertain futures. For many soldiers, those connections made an enormous difference. Research conducted after the war suggested that strong ties to home often improved morale and helped individuals cope with prolonged separation. Letters reminded servicemen that they belonged to something larger than the military unit surrounding them. They belonged to families, communities, and futures waiting beyond the battlefield. Of course, not every story ended happily. Some letters delivered difficult news. Some families experienced loss. Some soldiers never returned home to the people writing to them. Yet even in those circumstances, correspondence remained important. Letters allowed people separated by war to share moments of humanity. They preserved relationships across continents and oceans. They transformed pieces of paper into emotional lifelines. When you imagine World War II, it is easy to focus on dramatic battles, military strategy, and famous leaders. Those events certainly shaped history, but beneath those larger events existed millions of quieter moments. A young soldier unfolding a letter under dim camp lighting. A mother sitting at a kitchen table carefully choosing her words. A child drawing a picture to include inside an envelope. These ordinary acts connected distant lives during extraordinary times. The story of wartime loneliness is not only about separation, it is also about connection. It is about the determination of ordinary people to maintain relationships despite enormous obstacles. And perhaps that is why so many of those letters survived. They remind us that even during one of history's most destructive conflicts, people continued performing simple acts of care, one envelope at a time. The next chapter of this story moves beyond letters and into another challenge faced by countless soldiers far from home: the quiet struggle of spending holidays, birthdays, and special occasions in distant military camps instead of around familiar family tables. Story 2, Section 1, Christmas in a Tent. How soldiers celebrated holidays, far from family. Imagine it is December 1944. The ground beneath your boots is frozen solid. A cold wind moves through rows of military tents somewhere in northern Europe. The days are short, darkness arrives early, and the familiar signs of Christmas are almost entirely absent. There are no brightly lit shopping streets, no crowded family gatherings, no warm living rooms filled with familiar voices. Instead, you are a soldier thousands of miles from home, surrounded by fellow servicemen who are experiencing the same quiet sense of distance. For many soldiers during World War II, holidays became some of the most emotionally difficult moments of military life. Daily duties could distract from loneliness for much of the year. Training, maintenance work, patrols, and routine responsibilities filled the hours. But holidays had a way of reminding people what they were missing. Christmas was especially powerful. In many countries involved in the war, Christmas carried deep traditions. Families gathered for meals, churches held special services, children anticipated gifts, homes were decorated with whatever festive items families could afford. The holiday represented familiarity and continuity. War disrupted all of it. Military leaders understood the importance of maintaining morale during these periods. Across Allied and Axis forces alike, efforts were made to create some version of holiday celebrations, even in the most difficult conditions. The results were often modest. In camps across Europe, cooks attempted to prepare special meals using limited supplies. Sometimes soldiers received extra portions of meat, canned fruit, chocolate, or other treats that were rarely available during normal military rations. These meals were not luxurious, yet compared to ordinary field food, they felt extraordinary. A slightly larger serving of turkey could become the highlight of an entire month. A piece of cake shared among friends might be remembered years later. What mattered was not the food itself, it was the effort behind it. Even in active war zones, units often decorated their surroundings. Small Christmas trees appeared in barracks and tents. Some were genuine trees cut from nearby forests. Others were improvised from scraps of wood, wire, or available materials. Soldiers became surprisingly creative. Old ration boxes were transformed into decorations. Bits of colored paper were saved and reused. Empty shell casings sometimes became ornaments. Men who had never considered themselves artistic spent hours crafting small reminders of home. The decorations rarely looked perfect. That was not the point. They represented normal life in an abnormal environment. Music also played an important role. Military bands performed holiday concerts whenever circumstances allowed. Radios broadcast seasonal songs. Groups of soldiers gathered to sing familiar carols from memory. For a few moments, the sounds could transport people elsewhere. A song remembered from childhood might bring back images of family dinners or church services. Familiar melodies connected soldiers to places they had not seen for years. Letters became even more important during the holiday season. Families at home often made special efforts to send Christmas cards and packages. These items frequently contained photographs, handmade gifts, or small personal messages. Receiving such a package could completely transform a soldier's day. Many servicemen opened holiday parcels carefully, saving wrapping paper, ribbons, and cards. Nothing was wasted. The emotional value far exceeded the practical contents. Yet Christmas celebrations during wartime often carried an unusual mixture of happiness and sadness. The special meal reminded soldiers of meals they could not attend. The holiday songs reminded them of voices they could not hear. The decorations reminded them of homes they could not visit. In this way, attempts to reduce loneliness sometimes highlighted it. And nowhere was this contrast more noticeable than during Christmas Eve itself, when military camps grew quieter and thoughts naturally drifted toward home. As darkness settled over tents and barracks across the world, countless soldiers found themselves reflecting on the families they hoped to see again someday. But how did they spend those long holiday nights when home felt farther away than ever? Story 2, Section 2. Christmas in a Tent. How soldiers celebrated holidays far from family. As Christmas Eve settled over military camps around the world, the pace of daily life often changed. The usual noise of work details, vehicle maintenance, and training exercises faded. Even in wartime, commanders sometimes tried to create a brief pause in routine activities whenever circumstances allowed. The result was a kind of quiet unlike any other day of the year. For many soldiers, the evening hours became a time for reflection. Inside tents, barracks, and temporary shelters, men gathered around small heaters, stoves, or lanterns. Conversations often turned toward home. A soldier from Texas might describe Christmas dinners on a family ranch. Another from London might remember crowded holiday streets before the war. Someone from a small farming village could recall the smell of fresh bread or wood smoke drifting through winter air. The details varied, but the emotions were often the same. These memories helped fill the distance. Many soldiers carried photographs, and Christmas Eve was a common time to bring them out. Pictures of parents, spouses, children, and sweethearts were passed around among friends. Men who had spent months together frequently knew the names of one another's family members despite never meeting them. In a strange way, military units became extended families. Shared experiences created bonds that helped reduce feelings of isolation. A soldier might be thousands of miles from home, but he was rarely completely alone. This sense of companionship was especially important during the holidays. Some units organized informal celebrations. Card games stretched late into the evening. Small performances were held when someone could play an instrument. Amateur comedians entertained fellow soldiers with jokes and stories. The entertainment was usually simple. No one expected perfection. What mattered was the opportunity to laugh, talk, and briefly forget the uncertainty of war. In some locations, chaplains organized Christmas services. Attendance varied depending on personal beliefs, but these gatherings often attracted large crowds. The services offered moments of calm and familiarity in otherwise unpredictable surroundings. Soldiers listened to readings, sang hymns, and reflected on the passing year. For many, the service was less about religion alone and more about connection. It provided a structured reminder that life existed beyond military duties and battlefronts. Meanwhile, families at home were experiencing their own version of loneliness. Around dinner tables, empty chairs often served as visible reminders of absent sons, husbands, brothers, and fathers. Holiday photographs from the period frequently show families displaying military portraits alongside decorations. The separation worked both ways. While soldiers missed home, home missed them as well. This shared longing appeared frequently in wartime letters. Families described holiday celebrations in detail so their loved ones could feel included. Soldiers responded with stories of camp life, carefully choosing words that balanced honesty with reassurance. Many letters crossed oceans carrying the same message: "We are thinking about you." Sometimes those messages arrived weeks after Christmas had passed, yet they remained meaningful. The holiday season also revealed differences in how soldiers from various countries celebrated. Allied forces often included men from different regions, cultures, and religious backgrounds. Sharing traditions became a way to learn about one another. A Canadian soldier might explain family customs from home. An Australian serviceman could describe Christmas during summer rather than winter. British and American troops compared holiday foods and traditions. These exchanges added variety to otherwise repetitive military life. They also reminded soldiers that despite their different backgrounds, many of their hopes were remarkably similar. Most wanted the same thing: to survive the war, to return home, to celebrate future holidays with the people they loved. Yet even as Christmas passed and ordinary routines resumed, another reality remained. The war continued, new assignments arrived, troops moved between locations. Months of separation often stretched into years, and for many soldiers, the greatest challenge was not surviving a single holiday away from home. It was learning how to endure the long sequence of birthdays, anniversaries, and family milestones that would continue to pass while they remained far away. How did soldiers cope when they realized they might miss not just one Christmas, but several years of life back home? Story 2, Section 3, Christmas in a Tent. How soldiers celebrated holidays, far from family. As the war dragged on, many soldiers began to understand a difficult reality. Missing one Christmas was disappointing. Missing several years of holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, and family milestones was something else entirely. Time moved differently during wartime. Back home, children grew taller. Younger siblings became adults. Friends married. Families moved to new houses. Neighborhoods changed. Entire chapters of life unfolded while soldiers remained far away. Letters helped bridge the distance, but they could not stop time. A father might receive a photograph of a child he had not seen in years. A son might learn through a letter that an elderly grandparent had passed away. Important moments often arrived as words on paper rather than experiences shared in person. This realization could be painful, yet soldiers adapted in remarkable ways. One method was learning to celebrate milestones wherever they happened to be. Birthdays became group events. If someone received a package containing sweets, the contents were often shared with friends. Small victories, promotions, or successful missions became reasons for modest celebrations. The military environment gradually developed its own traditions. What began as temporary routines often became meaningful customs. Men exchanged small gifts made from available materials. They organized special meals whenever supplies allowed. They marked important dates with whatever resources they could find. These efforts helped create a sense of continuity. Life was still moving forward, even if it looked different than expected. Many veterans later recalled that the friendships formed during these celebrations remained among their strongest memories of the war. They remembered sitting around makeshift tables, sharing stories, and finding moments of normality amid extraordinary circumstances. The gatherings were rarely grand. In fact, their simplicity often made them memorable. A warm drink on a cold evening, a shared meal after weeks of routine rations, a handwritten card passed between friends. These small moments carried enormous emotional weight because they represented something larger than themselves. They reminded soldiers that human connection could survive even in difficult environments. Military organizations increasingly recognized this truth. Special entertainment programs expanded throughout the war. Concerts, theater performances, film screenings, and visits from performers became valuable morale-building tools. Though these events lasted only a few hours, they offered temporary relief from monotony and homesickness. For many soldiers, those hours mattered. They provided opportunities to laugh, relax, and reconnect with a sense of normal life. At the same time, families at home continued creating traditions that included absent loved ones. Holiday cards were saved, gifts were set aside, military photographs remained displayed in living rooms and on mantelpieces. The hope of reunion remained powerful. Even during the war's darkest periods, countless families planned for future celebrations. They imagined the meals they would share and the stories they would hear when their loved ones returned. Eventually, for many soldiers, that day arrived. The war ended, ships carried servicemen home across oceans, trains brought them back to towns and cities they had not seen for years. Families gathered at stations, docks, and streets to welcome them. The reunions were often joyful, yet many veterans later admitted that returning home was not as simple as they had imagined. Home had changed. They had changed too. The loneliness of wartime separation did not always disappear overnight. Some veterans spent months adjusting to civilian life and rebuilding relationships interrupted by years of absence. Still, the holidays that followed often carried special meaning. A Christmas dinner surrounded by family, a birthday celebrated at home, an ordinary evening spent with loved ones. These experiences felt extraordinary precisely because they had once seemed uncertain. When we look back on World War II, it is easy to focus on military campaigns and political decisions. Yet for millions of ordinary people, the war was also a story about missed holidays, distant families, and the effort required to maintain hope across long separations. The decorations in tents, the carefully saved Christmas cards, and the simple shared meals all reveal something important about human resilience. Even when people could not be together, they continued finding ways to create community, preserve traditions, and imagine better days ahead. And while holidays helped ease loneliness, soldiers soon discovered that another source of comfort would become just as important: the ordinary routines and daily habits that transformed temporary camps into places that felt almost like home. Story 3, Section 1. The quiet rituals of barracks life. Small habits that kept men sane. Imagine living in the same room as dozens of other people for months at a time. The room is crowded, boots line the floor, uniforms hang from hooks, metal bunks stand in long rows stretching from one end of the barracks to the other. Privacy is limited. Silence is rare. Almost every part of daily life is shared. For millions of World War II soldiers, this was normal life. Popular images of the war often focus on battles, dramatic operations, and moments of danger. Yet much of military service involved something far less exciting. Soldiers spent countless hours living in camps, barracks, and temporary shelters, repeating the same routines day after day. These routines could feel monotonous. Surprisingly, that monotony often became a source of comfort. Human beings generally prefer some degree of predictability. During wartime, when major events were often outside an individual's control, small daily habits became especially important. A soldier might wake at the same time every morning. He might fold his blanket in a particular way. He might clean his boots before breakfast. He might drink coffee with the same group of friends each day. None of these actions changed the course of the war, yet they helped create order within an uncertain environment. Many veterans later described these habits as anchors. The rituals provided a sense of continuity from one day to the next. Even when assignments changed or units relocated, familiar routines could travel with the individual. One of the most common rituals involved personal grooming. Military regulations required soldiers to maintain certain standards of appearance. Shaving, washing, and uniform maintenance became daily responsibilities. While these tasks were sometimes viewed as annoying, they also served a psychological purpose. Taking care of personal appearance reinforced a sense of self-respect. A soldier might have little control over where he was sent or what duties he received, but he could still polish his boots, shave carefully, and keep his uniform tidy. These small actions created a feeling of agency. Another important ritual centered around food. Military meals were often simple and repetitive. Yet mealtimes became significant social events. Soldiers gathered in mess halls or field kitchens several times each day. Conversations flowed naturally around tables. Stories were exchanged. News spread quickly. Friendships developed. The food itself was not always memorable, but the routine surrounding it often was. Breakfast in particular held special importance. The beginning of each day brought a familiar sequence of events: standing in line, collecting food, finding a seat among friends, and discussing whatever challenges lay ahead. The routine created stability. Leisure activities also played an important role. Whenever free time became available, soldiers sought ways to occupy their minds. Card games were especially popular. Decks of playing cards appeared in barracks across the world. Some games lasted only a few minutes. Others became ongoing competitions stretching across weeks or months. The games served several purposes. They reduced boredom. They encouraged social interaction. Most importantly, they temporarily shifted attention away from war. Reading was another common habit. Military libraries circulated books throughout camps and bases. Soldiers read novels, newspapers, magazines, and history books. Some pursued correspondence courses or educational programs offered through military organizations. Learning provided a sense of progress. Even while the war continued, individuals could improve skills and expand knowledge. Letters remained part of these daily routines as well. Many soldiers set aside regular times for reading and writing correspondence. The familiar rhythm of communication helped preserve connections to civilian life. Gradually, these habits formed a kind of unofficial structure alongside official military schedules. Together, they transformed barracks from simple sleeping quarters into communities. Yet communities bring their own challenges. Living closely with dozens of people meant sharing not only routines and friendships, but also frustrations, disagreements, and personal quirks. How did soldiers maintain harmony when privacy was scarce and the same faces surrounded them every single day? Story 3. Section 2. The quiet rituals of barracks life. Small habits that kept men sane. Living in close quarters sounds simple at first. After all, millions of soldiers shared barracks during World War II without major problems. But when dozens of people eat, sleep, work, and relax in the same space every day, even small habits can become surprisingly important. A snoring bunkmate could keep an entire row awake. Someone who never cleaned his equipment might irritate everyone nearby. A soldier who constantly borrowed items without returning them could quickly become unpopular. In civilian life, people often solve these frustrations by spending time apart. During wartime, that option was usually unavailable. The same faces appeared every morning. The same voices filled the room every evening. As a result, soldiers developed informal rules that helped maintain harmony. These unwritten rules varied from unit to unit, but certain patterns appeared almost everywhere. Respecting personal belongings was one of the most important. Space was limited, so possessions carried special significance. A photograph from home, a favorite book, a carefully saved stack of letters, a small souvenir. Such items often represented a soldier's connection to civilian life. Touching another person's treasured belongings without permission was generally considered poor behavior. Privacy, although limited, was also respected whenever possible. Many soldiers created tiny personal spaces around their bunks. These areas might contain photographs, postcards, or a few carefully arranged possessions. While the space itself was small, it provided a sense of ownership within a crowded environment. In a room shared with dozens of others, even a small corner could feel important. Humor also played a major role in daily life. Military memoirs are filled with stories of practical jokes, playful rivalries, and harmless mischief. Soldiers often used humor to reduce tension and cope with difficult circumstances. A funny story could spread through an entire barracks within hours. Nicknames became common. Small mistakes were remembered and retold repeatedly. Minor inconveniences were transformed into running jokes. These shared moments helped build group identity. Laughter reminded people that despite the hardships surrounding them, ordinary human experiences still existed. Of course, disagreements occasionally occurred. Arguments about noise, cleanliness, duties, or personal habits were inevitable. Yet many soldiers learned valuable lessons about cooperation because they had little choice but to coexist. Compromise became a practical necessity. Individuals from different regions, social classes, religions, and backgrounds suddenly found themselves living together. A farmer from rural America might share a barracks with a factory worker from a major city. A university student might sleep beside someone who left school years earlier. Before the war, their paths might never have crossed. Now they depended on one another. Over time, many soldiers gained appreciation for perspectives different from their own. Shared experiences often mattered more than personal differences. This gradual development of trust proved essential. During difficult periods, barracks communities frequently supported members who were struggling emotionally. A soldier who received bad news from home might find friends quietly offering encouragement. Someone feeling homesick could usually find another person willing to listen. Support rarely appeared in dramatic ways. More often, it came through small acts of kindness, saving a seat at a meal, sharing food from a care package, helping clean equipment, offering conversation during a difficult evening. These gestures strengthened social bonds and reduced feelings of isolation. Military leaders recognized the value of strong group cohesion. Units with healthy social relationships generally functioned more effectively. As a result, activities that encouraged camaraderie often received support whenever circumstances allowed. Sports competitions became popular in many camps. Baseball, soccer, boxing, and other recreational activities gave soldiers opportunities to socialize outside their regular duties. Friendly competition added variety to otherwise repetitive routines. For a few hours, attention shifted away from military responsibilities. The game became the focus. Yet, despite friendships, routines, and recreational activities, one challenge remained constant. Every evening, after the conversations ended and the lights dimmed, soldiers eventually found themselves alone with their thoughts. And it was during those quiet moments before sleep that many reflected most deeply on the life they had left behind, and the uncertain future waiting beyond the war. What thoughts filled those long nights when the barracks finally grew silent? Story 3, Section 3. The Quiet Rituals of Barracks Life. Small habits that kept men sane. Eventually, every day came to an end. The card games were finished. Conversations faded. Boots were lined neatly beneath bunks. The last letters were folded and tucked away. One by one, the lights inside the barracks were switched off. For a brief period, the room became quieter. Not completely silent, of course. There was always the sound of shifting blankets, distant footsteps outside, the occasional cough, or the steady hum of military life continuing somewhere beyond the walls. Yet compared to the activity of the day, nighttime felt different. It was during these hours that many soldiers found themselves reflecting. The routines that filled the day served an important purpose. They kept minds occupied and provided structure. But when distractions disappeared, thoughts often returned to home. A soldier might replay memories from years earlier, a family dinner, a fishing trip, a walk through familiar streets, a conversation with a parent, spouse, or friend. These memories were often ordinary. In fact, their ordinary nature was exactly what made them meaningful. Wartime separation gave new value to experiences that once seemed routine. Many veterans later remarked that they spent surprisingly little time imagining grand future achievements. Instead, they dreamed about simple things: sleeping in their own bed, eating a home-cooked meal, walking through their hometown, hearing familiar voices. The comforts of civilian life became powerful symbols of hope. Nighttime also encouraged reflection on the future. No one knew exactly when the war would end. Assignments changed, plans shifted, new orders arrived unexpectedly. Soldiers learned to live with uncertainty. This uncertainty affected everyone differently. Some focused on short-term goals, others counted the days since leaving home. Many avoided thinking too far ahead altogether. Yet even among uncertainty, routines continued to provide stability. Knowing that tomorrow would begin with familiar tasks helped reduce anxiety about larger events beyond personal control. The next morning would bring breakfast, work assignments, conversations with friends, letters if luck allowed. The cycle would continue. Psychologists today often discuss the importance of routine during stressful periods. World War II soldiers understood this principle through experience rather than theory. Their habits helped preserve emotional balance under difficult circumstances. The routines did not eliminate loneliness. They did not remove danger. They did not guarantee safety. What they did provide was something equally valuable: a sense of normality. Normality is easy to overlook when life is comfortable. During periods of disruption, however, it becomes precious. The act of shaving each morning, making a bed, playing cards after dinner, writing a letter home. These simple actions reminded soldiers that they remained ordinary human beings despite extraordinary circumstances. In many ways, the history of war is also a history of routine. Behind every major campaign and famous battle were millions of people performing small daily tasks. They cleaned equipment, prepared meals, shared stories, and followed habits that helped them navigate uncertainty. These details rarely appear in history books, yet they shaped everyday life for countless individuals. When veterans later reflected on their experiences, many remembered the routines as clearly as the major events. They remembered friends gathered around card tables. They remembered the smell of coffee in the morning. They remembered evenings spent reading letters beneath dim lights. Those memories reveal an important truth. Human resilience often depends less on dramatic acts of courage than on ordinary habits repeated consistently over time. The quiet rituals of barracks life helped soldiers endure separation, boredom, uncertainty, and loneliness. They transformed crowded military housing into communities and strangers into companions. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded people of who they were beyond the uniform. Yet, while routines provided stability, another force proved equally powerful during the war: friendship. In places far from home, among people who had never previously met, lifelong bonds were formed under extraordinary circumstances. How did complete strangers become some of the most important people in one another's lives? Story 4, Section 1. Friendship Under Fire: The Deep Bonds Formed Between Strangers. Imagine arriving at a military training camp for the first time. You step off a train carrying a small bag and a great deal of uncertainty. Around you are hundreds of other recruits. Some are young, some are older. They come from different towns, cities, professions, and backgrounds. Most have never met before. At first, they are simply strangers. A few months later, many of them will know one another better than some lifelong friends. World War II brought together millions of people who otherwise might never have crossed paths. Farmers from remote villages trained beside factory workers from industrial cities. Teachers, mechanics, clerks, students, fishermen, and laborers suddenly found themselves sharing the same barracks, eating at the same tables, and following the same orders. The process was not always easy. Differences in age, education, culture, and personality sometimes created tension. Yet military life placed people in circumstances that encouraged cooperation. Success often depended on teamwork, and daily routines created countless opportunities for relationships to develop. Friendship rarely appeared overnight. It emerged gradually through shared experiences. A conversation during breakfast, a card game after dinner, a long train journey, a difficult training exercise. These ordinary moments formed the foundation of trust. Many soldiers later struggled to explain exactly how certain friendships developed. There was no single event that transformed strangers into companions. Instead, familiarity grew through repeated interaction. People learned one another's habits. They discovered favorite stories, hometown memories, and personal ambitions. They learned who enjoyed joking, who preferred quiet conversation, and who could always be counted on during difficult situations. Over time, individual identities became woven into the life of the group. One soldier might become known for fixing broken equipment. Another might have a talent for storytelling. Someone else could be relied upon to keep spirits high during long periods of boredom. Every group developed its own personalities. These social bonds served an important psychological purpose. Military service often involved separation from family and friends. New relationships helped fill part of that emotional gap. No friendship could completely replace home. Yet companionship reduced feelings of isolation. The importance of these relationships became especially clear during periods of hardship. Training could be exhausting. Living conditions were sometimes uncomfortable. Long stretches of waiting created frustration and boredom. Facing such challenges alone would have been difficult. Facing them together made them more manageable. Shared meals played a surprisingly important role in strengthening friendships. Gathering around tables several times each day created opportunities for conversation and connection. Stories were exchanged, news was discussed, jokes circulated through the group. Over time, these routines created a sense of belonging. The same process occurred during travel. World War II required enormous movement of personnel. Soldiers spent days or weeks aboard ships, trains, and transport vehicles. Long journeys encouraged conversation and helped people learn about one another. Many lifelong friendships began during these periods of transit. The uncertainty of wartime often accelerated relationship building as well. When people face unfamiliar circumstances together, they frequently form stronger bonds than they would under ordinary conditions. Soldiers shared experiences that few people outside the military could fully understand. This shared understanding created trust. A person who endured the same hardships often required fewer explanations. Experiences that seemed impossible to describe to family members back home could be discussed naturally among fellow servicemen. The friendship became rooted in shared reality. As months passed, many units developed strong social identities. Individuals no longer saw themselves merely as separate soldiers. They viewed themselves as members of a community. This sense of belonging provided comfort during difficult times, but friendships formed during wartime would soon face an even greater test. Training exercises and daily routines were one thing. Real danger was something else entirely. How did these relationships change when soldiers found themselves confronting genuine risk together, far from home and dependent upon one another for survival? Story 4, Section 2. Friendship Under Fire. The deep bonds formed between strangers. As training gave way to active service, friendships often deepened in ways few soldiers could have anticipated. In civilian life, trust usually develops gradually over many years. During wartime, circumstances frequently accelerated the process. Individuals who had known one another for only a few months sometimes formed bonds strong enough to last a lifetime. The reason was simple. Military life created shared responsibilities. Every person depended on others to perform their duties properly. A mechanic needed drivers. Drivers depended on supply personnel. Infantry relied on communication teams. Entire units functioned through cooperation. This interdependence encouraged trust. When soldiers repeatedly observed one another handling difficult tasks, confidence grew naturally. Reliability became one of the most respected qualities within military communities. A person who consistently fulfilled responsibilities earned the respect of those around them. That respect often became the foundation of friendship. Long periods spent together strengthened these relationships further. Military service rarely provided much privacy. Soldiers worked together during the day, ate meals together, and often slept in the same barracks or tents. The result was an unusual level of familiarity. People learned one another's strengths and weaknesses. They knew who remained calm under pressure. They knew who struggled with homesickness. They knew who could tell a story that made an entire room laugh. These details created genuine human connection. Many veterans later recalled that conversations during quiet moments were among their most meaningful memories. Discussions often centered on ordinary subjects rather than military matters. People talked about future plans. They discussed careers they hoped to pursue after the war. They described homes, families, hobbies, and favorite places. Such conversations helped maintain a connection to civilian identity. The war occupied the present, but thoughts about the future remained important. Friendships also provided emotional support during difficult periods. Receiving disappointing news from home, coping with exhaustion, or dealing with uncertainty became easier when trusted companions were nearby. Support often appeared in subtle forms: a shared meal, a brief conversation, an encouraging word, a willingness to listen. These small gestures accumulated over time, strengthening relationships and reinforcing a sense of community. Humor remained a particularly valuable tool. Military memoirs frequently mention laughter appearing in unexpected places. Even during challenging periods, people found ways to joke, tease one another, and create moments of levity. Humor served more than entertainment. It helped reduce stress and reminded soldiers of their shared humanity. A familiar joke could transform the mood of an entire group. The friendships formed during wartime often crossed social boundaries that might have remained intact during peacetime. People from different regions, occupations, and economic backgrounds learned to cooperate and communicate. Shared experiences proved more important than social differences. This was one of the war's less obvious effects. Millions of individuals encountered people they might never have met otherwise. These interactions broadened perspectives and sometimes challenged long-held assumptions. The friendships extended beyond active service as well. Veterans frequently stayed in contact long after the war ended. Letters continued to be exchanged, reunions were organized, families visited one another across great distances. The relationships survived because they had been built under unusual circumstances. People remembered not only the major events, but also the countless ordinary moments spent together. The conversations, the meals, the routines, the shared experiences that transformed strangers into trusted companions. Yet even the strongest friendships faced a difficult reality. Wartime constantly introduced uncertainty. Units relocated, personnel were transferred, assignments changed. Sometimes friends who spent months together suddenly found themselves separated by hundreds or thousands of miles. And when those separations occurred, soldiers once again confronted a familiar challenge: learning how to preserve meaningful connections in a world where nothing seemed permanent. How did veterans remember these friendships after the war ended? And why did so many describe them as among the most important relationships of their lives? Story 4. Section 3. Friendship Under Fire. The deep bonds formed between strangers. As the war moved toward its conclusion, many soldiers began to think about life after military service. The idea of returning home brought excitement, relief, and anticipation, yet it also raised an unexpected question. What would happen to the friendships that had become such an important part of daily life? For months or years, many servicemen had rarely spent a day apart from their closest companions. They had shared meals, routines, responsibilities, and countless conversations. The people around them had become part of the structure of everyday life. Soon, that structure would disappear. When the war ended, millions of soldiers returned to homes scattered across vast distances. Some lived in neighboring towns. Others were separated by entire countries or oceans. Relationships that had once depended on daily interaction suddenly depended on letters and occasional visits. Maintaining contact was not always easy. Civilian life demanded attention. Jobs had to be found. Families reunited. New responsibilities emerged. Yet despite these challenges, many veterans made extraordinary efforts to remain connected. Letters once again played an important role. Former servicemen exchanged updates about careers, marriages, children, and everyday life. The correspondence looked very different from wartime letters, but the purpose remained similar. The letters preserved friendships. Reunions became another common tradition. Veteran organizations arranged gatherings where old friends could meet again after years or even decades apart. Photographs from these events often show aging veterans laughing together, much as they had during their younger years. Time had changed their appearance. It had not erased their shared memories. Many veterans described a unique quality to these relationships. They often felt able to resume conversations immediately, even after long periods without contact. The foundation built during wartime remained strong. Part of this strength came from shared experiences. Military service had created a collection of memories understood in similar ways by everyone involved. Certain stories required very little explanation because everyone present had lived through the same events. A simple reference could trigger hours of conversation. A familiar location, a remembered joke, a shared routine from long ago. These details carried meaning that outsiders might never fully appreciate. The friendships also endured because they were built on mutual dependence. During the war, people relied upon one another daily. Trust developed through actions rather than words. That trust proved remarkably durable. Even decades later, many veterans spoke about former comrades with deep affection and respect. Some remained closer to wartime friends than to people they met later in life. Historians studying veteran communities often note this pattern. The strongest memories were not always linked to famous events or dramatic moments. Instead, many centered on relationships. A friend who shared food during a difficult period, someone who offered encouragement when morale was low, a companion who helped transform loneliness into belonging. These stories appear repeatedly in personal accounts from the war. The friendships served another important purpose after military service ended. Returning to civilian life was not always straightforward. Veterans sometimes struggled to explain wartime experiences to family members who had remained at home. Former comrades often understood without lengthy explanations. Shared experience created a common language. This understanding helped many veterans navigate the transition back to ordinary life. Years later, when historians interview surviving veterans, conversations frequently return to friendship. Again and again, people describe the individuals they met during service rather than focusing exclusively on military events. The pattern is revealing. It suggests that one of the war's most lasting legacies was not only political or military, it was personal. Millions of strangers entered military service and emerged with relationships that shaped the rest of their lives. These friendships provided comfort during loneliness, stability during uncertainty, and connection during separation. They transformed unfamiliar environments into communities and difficult experiences into shared memories. And perhaps that is why so many veterans remembered their friends so vividly. The war eventually ended, but the bonds created during those years often lasted a lifetime. Yet for many soldiers, the final chapter of loneliness began not overseas, but after they returned home. because coming home, as many veterans discovered, was sometimes more complicated than leaving. The next story explores a quieter challenge faced by countless servicemen, returning to familiar places and realizing they were no longer quite the same people who had left. Story 5, Section 1. Returning home as a different person. The loneliness that continued after the war. For years, many soldiers imagined a single moment. The war would end. They would return home. Everything would finally feel normal again. Throughout World War II, this vision helped sustain countless people during long periods of separation. Whether stationed in Europe, North Africa, the Pacific, or elsewhere, soldiers often pictured the same scenes. A train pulling into a hometown station, family members waiting on a platform, familiar streets and familiar faces. Home became a symbol of certainty. After months or years of uncertainty, it represented stability, comfort, and belonging. Eventually, for millions of servicemen, the journey home began. The celebrations were often joyful. Crowds gathered to welcome returning troops. Newspapers published stories of reunions. Families prepared special meals. Neighbors stopped by to offer congratulations. From a distance, everything appeared perfect. Yet many veterans later admitted that returning home was more complicated than they had expected. The reason was not difficult to understand. The war had changed them. At the same time, life at home had continued moving forward without them. A soldier might leave home as a young man and return several years later carrying experiences that few people around him could fully understand. During his absence, family members had adapted to new routines. Children had grown older. Friends had started careers or families of their own. Everyone had changed. The changes were often subtle at first. A familiar neighborhood might seem smaller than remembered. Favorite stores could be gone. Local customs might have shifted. Even conversations sometimes felt different. Veterans frequently described a strange sense of familiarity mixed with distance. Everything looked recognizable, yet it no longer felt exactly the same. This experience surprised many returning servicemen. During the war, loneliness had usually meant being physically separated from home. After returning, some discovered a different kind of loneliness. They were home, but they sometimes felt disconnected from the life they had imagined returning to. Part of the challenge involved communication. Family members naturally wanted to hear about wartime experiences. Friends asked questions, neighbors expressed curiosity. Many veterans found these conversations difficult, not because they wished to hide information, but because certain experiences were hard to describe accurately. The routines, friendships, frustrations, and emotions of military life often resisted simple explanation. How could years of experience be summarized in a few conversations? As a result, some veterans chose to speak very little about the war. Others shared only humorous stories or harmless anecdotes. Serious memories were often kept private. This created an unexpected gap. Families wanted to understand. Veterans wanted to reconnect. Yet both sides sometimes struggled to find the right words. Daily routines also changed dramatically. Military life had been highly structured. Wake-up times, meals, duties, and schedules were clearly defined. Civilian life offered much greater freedom, but freedom required adjustment. Some veterans missed the routines they had once complained about. They missed the predictability. They missed the friendships. They even missed certain aspects of military community. For years, they had lived among people who shared similar experiences. Suddenly, they were expected to resume ordinary life as though nothing had happened. The transition was not always smooth. Many veterans eventually adapted successfully. They found work, built families, and established new routines. Yet the adjustment often required time and patience. The loneliness they experienced after the war looked different from wartime loneliness. It was quieter, less visible, more difficult for others to recognize. And for some returning soldiers, the challenge became learning how to build a new sense of belonging in a world that had continued changing while they were away. What strategies helped veterans reconnect with civilian life and find their place in the post-war world? Story 5, Section 2, Returning Home as a Different Person. The loneliness that continued after the war. For many veterans, the first weeks after returning home were filled with activity. Relatives visited, friends stopped by, neighbors welcomed them back. Meals stretched long into the evening as families celebrated reunions that had been anticipated for years. At first, the attention felt comforting, yet as weeks passed, the celebrations gradually ended. Visitors returned to their own routines. Communities resumed normal life. The extraordinary event of coming home slowly became an ordinary reality. This was when the true adjustment often began. Many veterans discovered that returning home was not a single moment. It was a process. Finding employment was one of the first major challenges. Wartime economies had transformed industries across many countries, and post-war societies were changing rapidly. Some servicemen returned to previous jobs, while others entered entirely new careers. Work provided more than income, it provided structure. After years of military schedules, many veterans appreciated having clear responsibilities again. A regular job helped establish routine and created opportunities to rebuild a sense of purpose. Education also played an important role for many former soldiers. Programs designed to assist veterans opened new opportunities for training and higher education. Men who might never have considered attending university before the war suddenly found themselves pursuing degrees, learning new skills, and planning different futures. These opportunities helped create momentum. Instead of focusing solely on what had been lost during the war years, veterans could begin concentrating on what came next. Friendships remained important during this transition. Many former servicemen continued corresponding with wartime companions. Letters traveled back and forth across countries and continents. Veterans shared updates about marriages, careers, children, and daily life. The friendships provided continuity. A person who understood military life could often understand the challenges of returning home as well. Veteran organizations became valuable communities for the same reason. Reunions, meetings, and social events allowed former servicemen to reconnect with people who shared similar experiences. These gatherings were not always focused on war. In fact, many centered on ordinary life. People discussed work, families, hobbies, and local events. The military connection simply provided a foundation for conversation. Family relationships also evolved over time. Rebuilding these connections required patience from everyone involved. Spouses who had spent years managing households independently had developed their own routines. Children who barely remembered a parent often needed time to form deeper relationships. Adjustment happened gradually. Shared meals, family outings, ordinary conversations, the simple routines of daily life slowly rebuilt familiarity. Many veterans later explained that these quiet moments mattered more than dramatic reunions. Lasting connection emerged through consistency rather than celebration. The process mirrored many lessons learned during military service itself. Just as routines helped soldiers cope with wartime loneliness, routines also helped them adapt to peace. Morning coffee with family, a regular work schedule, weekend visits with friends, community activities. These habits created stability. Over time, the feeling of being disconnected often began to fade. Yet memories of military life rarely disappeared entirely. A familiar song might trigger recollections of a barracks years earlier. A holiday gathering could bring back memories of Christmas spent overseas. A chance meeting with another veteran might instantly revive stories that had not been told in decades. The past remained present in small ways. Most veterans carried both worlds with them, the world they had left behind and the world they had built afterward. Rather than choosing between the two, many learned to integrate them into a single life story. Still, one final lesson emerged from these experiences. The loneliness of war and the loneliness of returning home revealed something important about human beings. People can endure remarkable hardships when they remain connected to others. Whether through letters, friendships, family ties, or community, connection provided strength. And as veterans reflected on their lives years later, many reached a similar conclusion about what mattered most. What they missed most was not the military itself, it was the people. Story 5, Section 3, Returning Home as a Different Person. The loneliness that continued after the war. As the years passed, the Second World War gradually moved from current events into memory. Uniforms were stored away. Military camps disappeared. Temporary wartime routines gave way to ordinary civilian life. Children grew into adults. Careers developed. Families expanded. Entire decades passed. Yet for many veterans, certain memories remained surprisingly clear. Not necessarily the moments that appeared in history books. Not always the major military operations or famous battles. Instead, many remembered the quieter details. They remembered waiting for mail. They remembered reading letters beneath dim lights. They remembered Christmas dinners in makeshift mess halls. They remembered card games in crowded barracks. They remembered conversations with friends long after the rest of the camp had gone to sleep. These ordinary experiences often remained vivid because they were connected to something deeply human, the need for connection. Loneliness had been one of the war's most common challenges. Millions of soldiers experienced it. Some felt it while crossing oceans. Some felt it during holidays. Some felt it while staring at old photographs late at night. Others experienced it after returning home, when they discovered that rebuilding a civilian life required patience and adjustment. The forms of loneliness changed. The underlying experience remained familiar. What allowed people to endure was rarely individual toughness alone. Historical records, letters, diaries, and personal memoirs reveal the same pattern repeatedly. Soldiers depended on one another. Families supported loved ones from afar. Communities maintained connections across enormous distances. Relationships provided stability. A letter arriving after weeks of waiting. A friend sharing a meal. A familiar voice in a crowded room. These moments carried significance far beyond their simplicity. The war demonstrated how much ordinary human connection matters. It also revealed the importance of routine. Throughout this series, you have seen soldiers creating small structures within uncertain circumstances. They wrote letters. They followed daily habits. They celebrated holidays as best they could. They formed friendships with strangers. None of these actions ended the war. None altered grand military strategies. Yet they helped people endure. History often focuses on leaders, governments, and major events. Those subjects are important, but history is also built from countless ordinary lives. The mother writing a letter at a kitchen table, the soldier carefully saving photographs from home, the group of friends sharing stories after a long day, the veteran learning how to rebuild a civilian routine years later. These quieter experiences rarely dominate headlines, yet they shaped the daily reality of millions. Perhaps that is why so many wartime letters, photographs, and diaries have been preserved. People recognized that these records captured something essential, not simply military history, human history. When modern readers examine those documents, they often encounter emotions that feel surprisingly familiar. Technology has changed, societies have changed, the world itself has changed, yet the desire for belonging remains much the same. People still miss loved ones. They still value friendship. They still find comfort in routine. They still seek connection during uncertain times. The soldiers of World War II were separated from home by oceans, continents, and years of conflict.
Yet they continued finding ways to remain connected to the people and places they cared about. Letters crossed dangerous seas. Holiday traditions survived inside tents and barracks. Friendships formed among strangers. Families waited patiently for reunions. Together, these small acts created resilience. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden within this story. The history of loneliness is also the history of connection. Even during one of the largest and most disruptive conflicts in human history, ordinary people continued reaching toward one another through words, routines, traditions, and friendship. As the camp lights faded, the letters were folded away, and the war slowly became memory. Those connections remained. Long after the uniforms were gone, long after the trains carried soldiers home, long after the world changed once again. They remained in the stories people told, the friendships they preserved, and the lives they rebuilt. And now, as this quiet journey through history comes to an end, you can leave those soldiers where history left them, writing letters, sharing meals, remembering home, and finding companionship in a world far from familiar. Their war eventually ended, but the human need for connection never did.